all by myself.
You know, you're killing me with that song. You're killing everyone with that song. You're going to drive the people away, and it's not that bad. I'm over here. Zoom, hello.
Hmm. One is the loneliest number that you'll ever do.
Oh, good Lord. Why do I deal with this?
All right, what's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another episode of the Sons of History podcast. I'm looking to my left, I'm looking to my right. No Alan Joaquin, where could he be?
I'm over here. I'm at home. I'm at, what? We want to tell people what? I'm in quarantine because I got exposed to the vid Monday night, neighbor. So,
Well, congratulations, man. Congratulations. All right, so I see you have the book behind you. What in God's name do you have next to it? Please tell me it's not what I
Oh,
think it
yeah.
is.
Well, remember last time I got, caught up with that medieval, Viking, and you didn't, the hatchet, and you did not have any band-aids. Well, I'm prepared. You want to know why I'm prepared? Because granted, yes, your axe or whatever was bigger than my little hatchet, but I came prepared, and so you may have the bigger hand, but this is like two pairs in a hand of poker. Huh? So I'm ready to take you on for another second round of medieval Viking battles.
Okay, not to spoil your fun, but it doesn't really matter if you have 2, 3, 4, 5 axes. You're at home. I am at home. We're nowhere near each other. Unbelievable. And it's not that I didn't have any band-aids. I had band-aids. I just didn't give you one.
Wait till next week.
Beautiful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're really looking forward to this conversation. It has already started off so well. Now, this is the final month of the third season, so we've only got a few more episodes left in this season, and also along with that, now if you want to keep in contact with us, this is the along with that. I didn't just like break off there. We've got a new newsletter that is going to be coming out, a weekly newsletter. So if you want to be part of that and you want to stay up to date on what we're doing, we've got a new documentary that's going to be coming out very soon. I have finally finished. Actually, a friend of Alan's who does audio stuff professionally, he is helping us out, just clean up some of the sound. So huge shout out to Rob. I don't want to say his full name because I don't know how, maybe an infringement on privacy. But Rob, if you're watching and listening, thank you so much. We owe you greatly. So a documentary is going to be coming out. We've got merch, and so all this stuff that you need to keep. Also, we'll have discounts and everything. So sign up for the newsletter. If you want to send us your email address, just shoot us an email at thesonsofhistory@gmail.com or just DM us on Facebook or Instagram. Yeah, so we've got a lot of things going on. That documentary is part one of our road trip documentary. That was good stuff. This is going to be the Denison stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. I'm glad that we're able to work with Rob. I knew Rob in high school, so it's long time coming. So I'm glad he's joining us, and I know you got a lot on your plate. So it'd be great to finally have a professional doing our music soundtrack and all that. Because the previous guy wasn't. Well, anyway, go on, please.
Let me go ahead and throw this out there. Rob may have taken offense to what you just said with "it's been a long time coming," as if he has owed us something in particular. I think he may think, I owe you this? I'm going to get back an empty clip.
No, Rob has been a fan of our show for a very long time, and he's been wanting to, get involved. And so, we found an opportunity. We needed him, and I'm glad. that we finally, was able to extend a hand from, or rather, take his hand of. No, I'm not kidding. No. He offered or extended his hand quite a while ago, and now we're like, we need him.
Today, Junior.
Glad we finally took part in it.
Man, that took you a long time to say. That was absolutely wonderful. Yes, can we just say it? Thank you, Rob. He's not doing the music soundtrack. Would you please with the music soundtrack? You and your, hey, I got a guy in Kingwood who does the high school band. Really? Are you going to write the score? Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, this has gone on long enough. I say we jump into This Week in History.
I think so.
All right, well, I will go ahead and start off This Week in History. Mine is a collaboration of sorts. I don't know why I'm looking at you. I need to be looking at the camera because these people are the ones that, actually matter. Exactly. So May 7th, 1915 and 1945. Those are my two dates. The 1945 one may right off the bat, you may know what that pertains to. But let's go with the 1951 or the 1915 one first. The British ocean liner, the RMS Lusitania, was torpedoed by the German U-boat U-20. This was done off the southern coast of Ireland, Orland. There was about 2,000 passengers, 1,959 passengers and crew. And out of all of those, almost 1,200 died. Counts have put out 1,195 people died on that sunken ship, the Lusitania. Now, 123, I've seen 114, I've seen 124, but let's just go with the 1, 2, 3. 123 American passengers died on that, and the ship actually went down in like less than 20 minutes. They said that there was the torpedo explosion, and then it was like a secondary explosion. I don't think they've really come to an exact conclusion of what that second explosion was. Once that second explosion happened, that ship it sunk super fast, and which is why you had so many people die from that. Now, we go to 1945, May 7th, 1945. This is 30 years later in a schoolhouse in Reims. How would you say that? Reims, Germany, or Reims, Germany?
Reims?
Yeah.
I heard it's pronounced Reims.
Reims?
Right. It's like the capital of the Champagne district.
Okay, so Reims, Germany. A man by the name of General Alfred Jody or Yodi.
Yodel.
Yodel.
Yodel. The J is silent.
Yeah, that's an L, not an I. Yodel. He signed the unconditional surrender of all of Germany, ending World War II in Europe. The document would take effect 1 minute after midnight on May 9th. In other German news, on May 6, 1937 in New Jersey, the German airship the Hindenburg exploded. Oh, the humanity.
Funny. The speculation that the Lusitania was carrying munitions, and that was possibly why there was a secondary explosion that pretty much doomed the ship at a much quicker rate than had just the torpedoes. So, speaking of torpedoes, we will go into mine. Monday, May 2nd will be the 40th anniversary of the Argentine light cruiser, the ARA General Belgrano, was torpedoed and sunk by a UK nuclear sub called the HMS Conqueror. So pretty interesting story, this ship. It used to be the USS Phoenix. It survived the Pearl Harbor attack, and it did take part in many operations in the Pacific Theater during World War II. It was sold to Argentina in 1951. Now, in the spring of '82, you had the Falklands War between Great Britain, or I should say, the United Kingdom, and Argentina. Argentina claimed the islands as the Malvinas, and Britain said, nope, it's the Falklands. So there was a war, and the Argentines invaded and took it over. Now, the United Kingdom had established a 200 nautical mile zone around the Falkland Islands. The first one, it was known as the Maritime Exclusion Zone. That was declared on April the 12th, which included all ships. But then on April 30th, they included aircraft, and then they called it the Total Exclusion Zone. So it was a 200-mile radius that went all around the Falklands. Now, there was the Argentine ship General Belgrano was outside the exclusion zone. April the 29th, it was the HMS Conqueror began to shadow it. And in London, there was a lot of debate. What should we do? It's outside the exclusion zone, but it is a threat. It's not retreating. It's just, moving about. Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister at the time. So they decided, what, it is a threat, even though it's outside the exclusion zone, let's just go ahead and sink it. So on May the 2nd, the Conqueror fired 3 torpedoes. Now, one torpedo hit an escort destroyer, but it did not blow up. The torpedo did not explode. But 2 torpedoes hit the Belgrano, the General Belgrano. They did explode, and the ship sank. So, it sank about 30 minutes after it was hit. It was very, very bad weather. 770 Argentines survived, 323 died. Now, in response to the sinking, because there was a lot of controversy of being outside the exclusion zone, the British decided, what, we're going to just make the exclusion zone, instead of 200-mile radius, it's just going to be the entire South Atlantic, except for the 12 miles outside the Argentine coast. So effectively, the whole area was an exclusion zone. So now, a couple of interesting things about the fact that this event happened. Number one, it was one of 2 sinkings in action by submarines since World War II. Since World War II, there have been only 2 ships torpedoed and sunk in enemy action. Now, the first one was in December of 1971. There was one of the India-Pakistani wars. A Pakistani submarine torpedoed and sank an Indian ship. But the Pakistani ship was not a nuclear sub. The Conqueror was a nuclear sub. So this is the only time ever that a nuclear submarine sank a enemy vessel in military action. So only a nuclear sub ever, and since World War II, one of 2 ships that had ever been sunk in action by a submarine, which is kind of funny since we spend so much money on submarines. Really there's not much that they do, if you think about it, other than, they're just there for preparedness. Another interesting tidbit is that the ship, the Phoenix / the General Belgrano, was the last Pearl Harbor survivor to be lost in action. So that Monday, May 2nd, will be the 40th anniversary again, happened in 1982.
Very interesting. Now, I thought you were going to say that one of the last 2 sinkings was the submarine that was going after the Red October, but ended up blowing itself up. But
that event didn't happen, and Admiral Greer was not there.
And I was never here. That's right. Speaking of never being here, thanks for not being here. I appreciate it. All right. Well, that is This Week in History. All right, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we've got a great guest for you. Speaking of the Lusitania, World War I. We're going to be talking about World War I. Now, Neil Lanctot is our guest. He is a historian and author of 4 books. He has written Fair Dealing and Clean Playing, The Hilldale Club, and the Development of Black Professional Baseball, 1910 to 1932, Negro League Baseball, The Rise and Ruin of a Black Institution, Campy, The Two Lives of Roy Campanella, and the latest, The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and the Clash over America's Future. Loved the book. Really, really enjoyable book. I've read it cover to cover. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Neil Lanctot is on the line. Neil, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Well, hey, I think this is maybe the first time this season that Alan and I have been in separate locations. So it's, I don't want to say that I feel naked, but I do feel alone. So, I don't know if you've ever watched that show. So, Alan's a huge. What is it? Naked and Alone or Naked and Afraid? What is it? Oh, dang! All right. Well, I'm not afraid, but anyways, we'll go ahead and get started. Now, I wanted to ask you the first question. You're a historian, but primarily you've done books on baseball. How did you get from baseball to World War One?
Well, I had done the three books really two books on the Negro League, and I'd done the Roy Campanella biography. And at that point, I felt I had gone as far as I could in that area. And I was hoping to reach more readers. A lot of people love sports in this country, but it doesn't mean they read books about sports in this country. So I was trying to find something more general history and kind of tap into that market. So that was what led me to something different. And as far as this particular topic, it was really a matter of I was looking at this older series of books about the early 20th century written by Mark Sullivan. It was known as Our Times. I mean, Mark Sullivan was this big shot journalist in the early 20th century. And he wrote in the late 20s and early 30s about modern America, 6 volumes, very interesting stuff. And I happened to pick up some of those books and started looking through them. And I looked at the book on World War One, just thought it was really fascinating. And I knew so little about it myself, and I thought this would make an interesting book, how we got into this war, because this is really significant, because our decision to go to war in 1917 had a dramatic effect on the war itself, and of course, the actual course of the 20th century. So that's what led me to pursue this topic and try to figure out a way to tell it. And what I decided was, let's try to find characters who can tell this story, and that led me to the trio in this book.
So your book is called The Approaching Storm, Roosevelt, Wilson, Addams, and the Clash over America's Future. Give us a breakdown of how Roosevelt, Wilson, and Addams felt about America getting involved in the war, because I know that those are 3 different avenues.
Well, it's interesting. When the war began in 1914, in the summer of 1914, a lot of Americans were absolutely shocked by this war. They couldn't believe such a thing was happening in the 20th century. It just seemed so barbaric. Aren't we beyond this? This is the progressive era. We're more enlightened. And all these 3 individuals, Wilson, Roosevelt, and Adams, are going to have a different perspective on this. Wilson was president at the time, and he had been in office for about a year and a half. He's someone who was a very improbable politician. He had been an academic. He had been president of Princeton University, and the Democrats came calling, got him elected governor of New Jersey, and then got him elected president in 1912. And he was someone who really didn't think that foreign affairs was his thing. Domestic affairs was what he was most interested in. And suddenly he's got this giant, humongous problem dumped on his lap in the summer of 1914. And he's also coping with his very, very sick wife, who's going to die in these early months of the war. She dies of kidney disease. So it's a very tough time for Woodrow Wilson. I mean, Wilson came to the conclusion pretty quickly that it was not our place to get involved in this war. What he was hoping to accomplish was to be a very important instrument in the peace process in the future. That's what he wanted America to do, to help bring about peace and also help to remake the post-war world. As far as how to accomplish that, he felt that staying out was the best way, remain very, very neutral right now. And that will be the path to us being called by these belligerent powers for assistance in the future. So we need to be neutral. We need to be neutral in thought and in deed. That's what he was pushing for in the early months of World War I. For Roosevelt, Roosevelt was out of office at this time. He'd been president till 1909. He decided very quickly by 1912 he wanted to be president again, ran on a third-party ticket in 1912, was beaten. And by 1914, he's having a difficult time as far as his prestige in America. You know, his party is already kind of falling apart, this Bull Moose or Progressive Party. And the guy in the White House is a man he hates. He hates Woodrow Wilson. He detests him. And what's the worst thing is that this incredibly important global event is occurring, and poor TR is not in the White House to be dealing with it. Woodrow Wilson is. Roosevelt, I think, initially sort of agreed with Wilson's perspective as far as the war was concerned. He wrote, really after the war began, he said something to the effect that, well, when giants wrestle, you know, people are going to get trampled in the middle here. So, you know, even though Belgium was invaded by the Germans, we really can't get involved in this or protest this. But within a short time, he came to believe that Wilson had totally botched this, that we should have protested the invasion of Belgium if we were worth anything as a country.
What about Adams? What was her view?
Well, Adams was, you know, a big time progressive and reformer. You know, she had made her name getting involved in Hull House. You know, Hull House was a settlement house in Chicago, and that had put her on the map. It's like these sort of social centers that were set up in the big cities as a way to minister to the poor and the immigrant communities. So she had set up Hull House in Chicago, and then she got involved in just about every kind of cause in the late 19th, early 20th century. So she was a big name in those days. One of the most famous women in America, although she's not really well known today. You know, some of the interviews I've done for this book, a lot of people have asked me that question. I said, I never heard of Jane Addams before reading this book. She deserves to be much better remembered than she is. But Addams, you know, she was really involved in the suffrage movement before the war began. But when this happened, she really shifts most of her attention to this other great cause, which is pacifism. But when we say pacifism, we shouldn't think of it as nonviolent pacifism. I mean, her idea was more of a dynamic pacifism, that the United States should be doing everything in its power to find a way to get the two sides to start talking, get them to the peace table. This is what the Wilson administration should be doing. It should be making constant outreaches to the belligerent powers. Her big idea, which she supported and tried to get Wilson interested in, was some sort of conference of neutrals, which, you know, would be the United States and other neutral powers would get together, and that would act as sort of a bridge to a larger peace conference in the future. So Addams is going to be, you know, and her followers will be very insistent on this, that the American responsibility is to try to find a way to end the war, whatever way possible, and that's what the United States should be doing. Basically, throw all of her might on the scale for peace. So those are the three perspectives of these three individuals who were bound by their progressivism, but also they knew each other very well, born around the same time. You know, so they were just three random figures I chose in this book. These were people who knew each other, interacted with each other, and at times were quite close to one another.
Well, now we know now Teddy Roosevelt, or I should say Roosevelt. Roosevelt was FDR. Teddy Roosevelt, he fought in a war. He was in the Spanish-American War, and he got a Nobel Peace Prize because of the Russian-Japanese War. So we know he liked to get involved, and you know, he felt that America should have played you know, more of a hand in stopping the outbreak of war, especially since you know, we all signed on to the Hague Convention. Was that a feasible claim, number one? And number two, was Wilson up to the task of trying to stop it? You know, when you look at the fact that you mentioned that his first wife had died. Your book claims that Wilson really was not up to the task. You know, what are your thoughts on what Roosevelt and Wilson?
Well, you know, TR had said, you know, later on after the fact, that if he had been in the White House and any other president worth his salt would have been able to at least get a delay in the early hours, days of the war, to get them to at least talk a little bit more to stop this from happening. That if the United States had made some statements, you know, saying that we will regard this as an unfriendly act, Germany, if you do these things, that Germany would have backed off slightly, enough to get some sort of conversation or dialogue going on between these nations that would have at least delayed the outbreak of war. This was Roosevelt's belief. Maybe it was a fantasy, and maybe it was also part of his own belief that Wilson wasn't incompetent as far as that was concerned. But Roosevelt did believe that. As far as Wilson was concerned, there's no question. I think he was having a sort of breakdown after his wife died, and his wife died in August, right when the war is unfolding. Whether it affected his job capabilities, I'm not so sure, because he was a very driven person, a very, he even said the work is what kept him going. I mean, that's the way he dealt with emotional issues and problems and discomfort, was to throw himself into his work. And there's a scene in the book where he's walking in New York. This is in the fall of 1914 with Colonel House, his advisor. And House documented everything in his diary, and Colonel House wrote something to the effect that, the president, was walking with me on the streets of New York, and he said he wished someone would shoot him because he was so depressed. He was depressed with the loss of his wife. But he said, I'm sure no one will, so I'll just keep on going and do the work that I have to do. So, I mean, it's an interesting thought whether he was psychologically unable to cope with what was happening. But I tend to think, again, his whole belief system about himself and everyone else was built on self-mastery and being able to keep a grip on your emotions. So I'm not sure it really affected his decision. I think he was probably comfortable with how the United States handled things in the summer of 1914. People like Roosevelt came to think he was not. And as far as the Hague Convention was concerned, legal scholars then said Roosevelt was wrong. There was nothing in the Hague Conventions that said the United States had to do anything in this situation. There was nothing legally binding them to do anything. Now, Roosevelt would have said, well, the United States at least should have protested this action, the invasion of Belgium in particular. And perhaps he was correct in that regard, as a way to show, this is what the United States stands for, and we're against these kinds of acts of aggression around the world.
Well, now you mentioned Colonel Edward House. It seemed like Wilson relied on him solely. He went and spoke with the English, the British, and the French, and I know that he gave a warning saying, these guys want to fight. They want to be in a war. Tell us, who is this Colonel House, and what influence did he have on the war?
Colonel House, to put it mildly, was a piece of work. I mean, he truly was. And I don't think there's anyone like him in American history, someone who had so much influence on the president, but never had an official title. I mean, House was this guy from Texas who had always been interested in politics. He had money, and he had gotten involved in Texas politics, Texas Democratic politics, and he had helped make a few governors and a few successful politicians. But then he decided he wanted to go national in the early years of the 20th century. And in the 1912 election, he eventually got himself introduced to Wilson. And soon there was this very, very close relationship between these two men. They seemed to have so much in common, and they seemed to think the same way. The problem is, a lot of what we know about the Wilson and House relationship comes through House. I mean, House kept this unbelievably detailed diary for years. Every night he would dictate a fairly lengthy account of the day. And a lot of what he says, that's why House's diaries are very valuable, and I use them a lot in this book, but they have to be used with care because they're told through the perspective of someone who's trying to make himself look really good. So House ingratiated himself with Wilson, maybe that's a little too strong to say, but Wilson, soon came to rely on this man. And Wilson had much more trust in House than he did his cabinet. He thought most of his cabinet members were a bunch of dolts. He didn't trust his ambassadors. He thought most of them were incompetent, but he trusted House, and House was allowed to go on these missions, these sort of, this man on a mission to Europe, even before the war started. And then after the war, he went over a couple times, and he's meeting with all these diplomats. And Wilson believed that House was representing his views, but often House went beyond what Wilson wanted him to do, and House did his own thing. And I think House fancied himself more of a skillful diplomat than he really was. And I think there were times when the European diplomats ate him up and spit him out. They knew what he was all about, and I think they played him at times. But I don't think Wilson really realized House, what he was all about, until much later, being at Versailles, which I touch on very briefly in the book, where Wilson cuts him off at Versailles in 1919. But they were very, very close for a long time. And Wilson trusted him implicitly, and House kind of played this game that I'm the man who wants nothing. I just want to be a devoted friend. But I think he loved what he was doing, and loved that he had no responsibilities to anyone except the president, and he was on no leash whatsoever. And he was allowed to have enormous influence in the administration.
Did House's influence overseas with the belligerent nations, did that do anything to assist, or did it do anything to hinder, I guess, the effort on America's part and what was going on against with the belligerent nations? Was there any, or was it like you're over here and there's absolutely no reason that you're over here? You're just over here talking.
I mean, I think he was looking for ways. He and Wilson were looking for ways to find a way to achieve peace. The problem was that I think House pretty much promised the Allies everything. He didn't really negotiate them with the way that I think Wilson would have wanted him to do. Pretty much, House went over there and said, you know, the Americans want you to win the war. We want to do everything we can do to help you win the war. So on the other hand, Wilson wanted him to work with the Allies, and particularly the British, about some of their abuses of international law, their interference with American trade. But House was never pushed that very hard, even though, of course, there was weapons that he had in his pocket. I mean, the British came to rely so much on American financial support and loans and things like that, and House really never used that very well. I mean, at one point, House got this deal with the British, the House-Gray Memorandum, where the idea was that the Americans would come in at some point, that there would be an attempt to bring the two sides together, and if the Germans refused, then the United States would probably come in on the side of the Allies. This was this agreement, and House felt this was going to lead to peace. But even with this very sweet deal that the Americans were offering and House was offering, the British still didn't want it. They really didn't want any of these American offers unless they were in deep trouble. I think even there's a letter I quote in the book where I think one of the British officials said, if the French can't fight anymore and they're really desperate, then some of these schemes that House is offering might be worth investigating. I think that's what the British basically did. We'll talk to House, we'll listen to his ideas, listen to what the Americans are saying, but we really want to win this war decisively. Only if we're going to lose it, or in danger of, our allies are in danger of being defeated, will we seriously consider some of these offers that House is making.
So to pull back in, Jane Addams. Now you mentioned, and talking about her influence internationally, you mentioned how Addams was able to get a conference with German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann and the Foreign Minister Gottlieb von Jagow, or Jagow. I don't know how to say that, but I'm sure I'm butchering it.
Isn't that Jagow?
As long as we're not German, none of us are German, so you can say anything you want. So
there you go. Jagow. Yeah. So she got a meeting with them shortly after the sinking of the Lusitania. So how does this prove how influential Addams was internationally?
I think she was a very big figure. I mean, she was known globally before the war because of the work she had done. And then in 1915, she had helped establish this new peace organization, the Women's Peace Party, which was, this unprecedented American women's peace organization. But in early 1915, she traveled to Europe to be part of this Women's Peace Congress. And afterwards, she and a group of others went to talk to the leaders of the belligerent nations. And yes, as you say, she was a big enough name where once one country agreed to see her, they all had to. So once she went to England and talked to the prime minister and people like that, the Germans figured, well, we want to placate the Americans, we better talk to her too. So it's really quite remarkable. It's citizen diplomacy before I think that term existed. And I think they were relatively candid with her up to a point. I think both sides said the same things. Yeah, we're interested in peace. If you can find a way to bring it, we're not going to object to it. But I think it still came down to how far were they willing to go to get peace. I mean, Addams was not under any illusions about this. I think she was a realist. I mean, Colonel House tried to undercut her, and later on he wrote in his diary like, "Oh, Jane Addams went to Europe and they were not frank with her." Well, many of the people that House met were not frank with him either. So I think both sides tended to feel it was important to talk to these Americans, whether it was House or Jane Addams or whomever, and show that we're interested in peace, because we still want to win the hearts and minds of the American public. I mean, I think both sides were very concerned about the role of America in this war before we were ever involved. And the Germans would be happy if we would stay out of this war. So the Germans didn't want to antagonize the United States needlessly. And of course, the Allies felt the same way.
Well, so the Lusitania ocean liner gets torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat, but we didn't go to war. You know, a lot of people think, oh, Lusitania is sinking, led us into the war. I know it changed sympathies, but in the presidential campaign of 1916, Wilson ran. Motto was, he kept us out of war. So then we have the Zimmerman telegrams, and then we have the Germany deciding that they're starving and they need to start up the unrestricted warfare once again, the unrestricted submarine warfare. But now Wilson again ran saying he kept us out of war. Now he's inaugurated in March, and then the very next month he declares war and gets us into the war. How difficult of a decision was that for Wilson? What were the reasons, in your opinion, that got us into the war? Was it Zimmerman and the unrestricted warfare? Was there something else behind it? How difficult was it for Wilson to ask for the war, and how was Roosevelt and Adams' reaction to that?
Well, there were a lot of different factors swirling around at the end of 1916, as you mentioned. One of the big factors was Germany's sense that, well, we can't win a long war, and we got to wrap this war up pretty soon, and especially while we're ahead right now, because the Germans were probably ahead in late 1916. So what they were hoping to achieve in late 1916 was they wanted the Americans to somehow launch some kind of peace initiative, get the two sides to start talking, and maybe ideally that will lead to a ceasefire and a peace conference, and the war will end. Germany will be probably ahead and get to keep what they've conquered up to this point. That's what they were hoping, because they knew if the war went on for a number of years, they were going to lose. They would be worn down. There was no question about it. Wilson was not ready to act yet because he had to win the election. Now he wins the election November 1916. And what's going to push him towards acting, not because of the Germans' need to win the war, but more a belief that he had been warned pretty directly by the Germans. In fact, the Kaiser had sent something over suggesting that we've dialed back our submarine warfare, to placate you, but we're going to have to resume unrestricted submarine warfare if peace does not come soon, because we got to win this war soon. That's what's coming. So Wilson could see that if unrestricted submarine warfare is resumed, America will be dragged into the war. And he thought, okay, we have to try to avoid that if we can. So in the fall of 1916, after the election, Wilson tried to work on a peace effort. And in December, he did float this sort of peace outreach to both sides, but it didn't really accomplish much of anything. And the Germans themselves earlier in December had also floated sort of a half-hearted trial balloon for peace, and that didn't go anywhere either. So the Germans decided in early 1917, okay, this failed. We're going to go back to the unrestricted submarine warfare. Yes, it's going to bring the Americans in. But if it does, too bad, because the Americans have a really small army, number one. And by the time they get it even up to snuff and are prepared to deploy a large force across the ocean, it'll be months from now. And by then, our submarines will succeed in starving out the British, and we will win the war in 6 months. That was the plan in a nutshell. I don't think anyone really could conceive of an alternate scheme, but that's what their scheme was in early 1917. So the Germans made this decision. They informed Wilson of it, and Wilson at that point severed diplomatic ties. So that was the first big move towards putting us in the war, was in early 1917. The other very important factor, of course, as you mentioned, was the Zimmerman telegram. The Zimmerman telegram was a totally wacky, cuckoo, crazy scheme coming out of the German Foreign Office by some of the, I'd say, the less sensible members of the German Foreign Office. This idea that, well, let's see if we can get Mexico as an ally. So if there's war comes, we'll ask Mexico to maybe be our ally, and we'll offer them, if they set up an alliance with us, they'll even get the opportunity to conquer territory that once belonged to them in the United States, which was totally crazy. What they really were hoping, what the Germans were hoping, I think they knew this wasn't realistic. They were hoping that the Mexicans would tie up American forces on the border so they can't be deployed in Europe. And they were also hoping with the Zimmerman telegram that this would be a sort of bridge to getting Japan involved, the Japanese, as a potential German ally. So the whole thing blew up in their face when the British intercepted this and then turned it over to the United States, and then the Wilson administration leaked it. This was another precipitating factor, but not as big as people say, because I noticed in my research that people stopped talking about the Zimmerman telegram within about 2 or 3 weeks. It was it was just another thing to consider for Wilson. Made him distrust the Germans even more, made the American people quite upset. But I think logically, most people realize that the Mexicans, their whole country is practically falling apart at the seams. They've had civil wars for a few years. They are in no position to really threaten us with anything. But still, it just showed German underhandedness. So those factors are very important for Wilson. I think the final thing was Wilson's belief that if we as America, and if I, Woodrow Wilson, I'm going to have influence in the peace process, the United States has to get in this war. We won't have any influence otherwise. And there's a scene in the book where Addams goes to the White House in early 1917, and Wilson tells her this. Wilson says, if we don't send troops to fight, I'll be lucky to get into the peace conference through a crack in the door. And that was unacceptable to Woodrow Wilson. I think he had this view that it was his destiny, to shape the post-war world and to bring peace, and to, America has to fight in this war. It's a necessary evil. It was very discouraging for Jane Addams to hear that coming out of Wilson's mouth. But so I think all these factors, the Zimmerman telegram, the unrestricted submarine warfare, his own belief that we've got to fight if we're going to mean anything as a country, which is kind of what Roosevelt said all along, and we're going to have influence on the peace. This is why we have to go to war. And that's why in April 1917, as you mentioned, he goes to Congress and gets that declaration of war.
That is, it's so many moving parts, and your book does a fantastic job of tying in all those moving parts. So many different narratives going on in the book, not just the big three, but you tie in House, and you tie in the belligerent nations, the ambassadors and the other diplomats, and then you tie in people like Henry Ford and a bunch of other like pacifists who are joining in with Jane Addams. And then you have obviously the cabinet members that are on Wilson's staff. There's so much going on in this book, but you've done a fantastic job of making sure that all of it streamlines in the same way. Now, obviously, this is something that you don't address in the book because this is a what if. This is a last question. Some what ifs. If Roosevelt had been president at the time, one, do you think that we'd have gotten in the war much sooner? And two, with how it panned out, how it worked out with us getting involved in the war, do you think that ultimately was the right choice?
Well, those are some really good what ifs. Roosevelt probably, if he were here, he probably would have said, no, I would not necessarily have put us into the war, because what I would have done, and I think he was right on this one, is I would have built up our defenses and our military to such a degree that the Germans would never have been as cavalier in their behavior towards us. This was the argument that Roosevelt expressed multiple times against Wilson. Because when the war begins, we have a pathetically small army. We have a 100,000 man army, which is nothing. So there's not much we really can do. And this is why Roosevelt gets behind this whole preparedness movement of that we've got to be ready for this war, and if not this war, the next war that's coming. And Roosevelt even said, I can see Germany, if they come out ahead in this war, might team up with Japan in the future, which is interesting. He was already able to see that happening in the future. So I think Roosevelt probably would have said, I could have avoided war. He often said that Woodrow Wilson was involved in more little wars than I ever was. The Wilson administration was sending men to Haiti and to the Dominican Republic and all these little wars, that I am more of a man of peace than he is. It's funny that all the three characters in this book, Wilson, Addams, and Roosevelt, all won the Nobel Peace Prize. So they all had some pacifist credentials to them. So that's my take on Roosevelt. I think if Roosevelt were president in 1917 and everything had unfolded the way it had unfolded, yes, he probably would have been ready to go to war sooner. But again, he would have said we would not have ever gotten to this point if we had been firmer and had more of a military to speak of. Now, of course, Wilson was very hamstrung by Congress. It would be very hard, I think, in 1914 to get Congress to vote for some military buildup. Most people didn't want it in 1914. So even if Roosevelt had been president, I think it would have been very hard to get that through, but maybe he could have, I don't know. Second question, was it the right decision? Some people might disagree, that it was the right decision. And there's some mentions in the book about this where, Bernstorff, who was someone I do talk about in the book quite a bit, the German ambassador, and Bernstorff later said that, if America doesn't get involved in this war, it's quite possible that there might have been a draw in this war. Neither side would have gotten the upper hand, and that might have been better off overall for Europe in the future. It may not have led to the problems that unfold in the 1920s and the rise of Hitler and things like that. We can't know for certain whether that would have happened. We don't know. But there's certainly an alternate scenario that perhaps getting involved in this war could have been a mistake. I think by the 1930s, many Americans thought it was a huge mistake. There was really a backlash against our involvement in the war. This belief that we'd been tricked, by the munitions people and the bankers that tricked us into going into World War I. I think that's why FDR in the 30s had a much harder time getting Americans to realize the threats that were unfolding in Europe, because a lot of Americans felt we got burned in 1917. We're not going to get burned again and send our boys over to fight in some European war that doesn't concern us. I think even if there had been polling in 1917, I think many Americans probably would not have been in favor of going to war. I think Wilson, if he wanted to, could have probably kept us out of the war in 1917. He would have been very strongly criticized by people like Roosevelt, but I suspect that much of the American population would have said, we can stay out of this war. The number of men and women, children who have been killed by German submarines is not substantial enough to warrant throwing us into this incredibly bloody and destructive war, the worst in history up to this point.
I was going to ask you real quick that, part of the reason why Germany had the unrestricted submarine warfare was because of the Britain's Royal Navy blockade of Germany, and they were starving the German people. In 1914, Britain was doing the same thing to the Americans that they did to the Americans in 1812, which almost got us into the war against Britain in 1914. Do you believe in that conclusion?
Well, it's funny. Wilson did, and Wilson made that very early in the war. He made that statement saying this seems like a parallel to the War of 1812 with some of the naval issues. What's interesting in my research, I was surprised to see how much friction there was between the UK and the United States. There's a lot of back and forths. The American people were not happy with the interference with our trade and with the violation of international law. But as Roosevelt said at the time, and I think Wilson did too, the difference is the Germans were taking lives with their submarine attacks. Inadvertently, they were intentionally trying to kill Americans, but Americans were being caught in a crossfire. Whereas the British were simply interfering with property. Property could be paid for, human lives cannot be restored. But the British were at times quite frustrated with the United States. They felt like, we're fighting for our lives here. We're fighting for, democracy and all these good things. You guys are bothering us about stuff like, goods being intercepted or opening up mail. Can't you just leave this stuff alone till after the war is over? You see a lot of interesting correspondence in the British foreign archives about, some of the British diplomats saying these Americans, all they care about is money. And they really don't have a strong connection with us. They don't really care about the mother country like we think they do. But I don't think there was ever any possibility of us going to war with Great Britain or the Allies. There was annoyances with them, but I think in general there was also so much money we were making off them too. The munitions trade with the Allies was astronomical by 1915, 1916, and we're financing their war by the end of 1916. If Wilson had simply said no more loans, that's it, we're not giving you any more money, their entire war effort would have collapsed. I don't think Wilson was aware of that. The American public was not. American people were not aware of it. but we really did hold the purse strings by 1916, early 1917.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the book is The Approaching Storm. Neil, I'm going to say this. I've read a lot of books this past year, as I'm sure you well are aware. I know Alan is. One of my favorite books of the past year. It was really good, hard to put down, and just so much information, and it gave me, but it will also give readers a view of what was going on in America during the Great War, the Great European War. And I thank you for writing it, and I thank you for joining the Sons of History podcast.
Well, thank you again for your very kind words, and it was a lot of fun being on your podcast.
Well, good job. Good job finding this gentleman. I really enjoyed the conversation with Neil. Enjoyed his perspective on things, because I've always been a big fan of the First World War, the Great War. It's a shame that it's not really studied that much in this country, because it wasn't a feel-good war, that we beat the bad guy. There wasn't necessarily really a bad guy in this war, just a lot of bad decisions. And and the United States really was not in charge of the outcome. It wasn't in charge of the peace that took place afterwards, like we were with World War II. And but I did like his perspective. I read a previous book on what was going on with the Europeans, and I know that Colonel Edward House was discussed. But that particular book discussed primarily what was going on with all the European powers. This one was very refreshing because we got to get the American perspective. I'm not that big of a fan of Woodrow Wilson. I do love Teddy Roosevelt, and I have to admit I was a little ignorant about Jane Addams. But with this conversation or with this book, I think people will gain a new perspective and learn about a lot of the diplomacy that took place. I knew that wasn't the case, but years ago I thought we went to war because of Lusitania, and then there was the whole Zimmerman telegram and the unrestricted warfare, and the thing that he pointed out was that the Zimmerman telegram really wasn't that much of a factor. It was really the unrestricted submarine warfare and what the implications were if we did not get involved in the war. Because Wilson wanted to have his place at that table, and he was very much wanting, the whole Wilsonian democracy came about because of him and our involvement in the European powers because of this war. So it was good to get his take and his perspective on it. And this book really does do a great job in illustrating what was going on during that time period.
Yeah, no, it is a really, really good read. And I think you and I agree that Wilson is sort of this figure that you and I not big fans of. But this book, it's sort of a mix of emotions, because during the book, especially when his wife is sick and then she passes away, it's like he's somewhere else. He is not focused on being the president of the country. And then he recoups, and then he falls in love again and eventually gets remarried. But even during that time, he is like, where are you? Like, focus on what's going on. There is that frustration with the man who was the president of the United States. But at the same time, there is a lot in here that presents Wilson as a sort of a sympathetic figure, because all of this is going on and he is sort of being pulled in various ways, and there's immense amount of pressures, and it sort of puts you in perspective, like, man, how would I deal with this situation? Sort of a situation that had never happened before on the scale of what the military might was at that time. This is not your Napoleonic warfare. This is modern age warfare that has never been seen before. The closest, I guess, that the world had more or less seen was probably during our Civil War, but even then, it's like nowhere in comparison. But yeah, he does a great job. And speaking of Jane Addams, yeah, I didn't know who Jane Addams was either. I'm sure you may have known who she was, but maybe not a lot. But I was like, I don't know who Jane Addams is, but we're going to find out. It's such a fantastic read. And yes, it is refreshing that it deals with America's view, not just the higher ups, but how a lot of just regular people felt about, do we get involved in this war or do we not get involved in this war? So, highly recommend this book. And speaking of recommending books, book and movie recommendations. Now, I'm going to tell you this, Alan. I know that you said good job finding Neil Lanctot. I'm going to surprise you with this. I may not have told you. He found us. He found us. He reached out to us and was like, hey, man, I really enjoy y'all's show. I'd like to be on it. Hello. So we are moving and we're shaking and we're doing all types of things. So The Approaching Storm, go get it. It is now available. It came out October of last year. A fantastic read. You want to add something to it, Alan?
Yes, I'm going to recommend it highly. A lot of Americans don't realize, that the way we are the major power in the world, the way we have the greatest military in the world. It wasn't like that prior to the First World War. Prior to the First World War, we were a neutral nation. There was no NATO. There was no United Nations. There was no League of Nations. When the League of Nations was created, we did not ratify the treaty to be in it. We did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We were a neutral nation. We preferred neutrality. We had just, went into Mexico to stop Pancho Villa because Pancho Villa and his horde, invaded the United States and killed some Americans. So, that was the United States. We were so vastly different. We were not the powerhouse. France, England, they were the powerhouse. We had and it's pointed out in this book is that the economics of the United States was doing very well. There was a vast difference between how people lived, especially the younger generation, during the first 16 years of the 20th century versus how people lived just 50 years prior or 40 years prior. Totally different. The Industrial Revolution really made America into this economic powerhouse. So get this book. It'll give you a major perspective of what life was like in the United States before we got ourselves involved in all these alliances with the Europeans.
Yeah, and then speaking of, because I know I'd mentioned the part 1 documentary of what we were working on with our road trip history documentary. We went to Denison, which is the birthplace of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and what ends up happening is what Eisenhower warned us against, which is the military-industrial complex. Now we can't not get involved in a war, and I know that we're trying to stay somewhat hands off during the Ukraine Russia situation, but man, really, like, after World War II, like the warning that Eisenhower gave has not really been heeded since then. Now, my movie recommendation, I probably have recommended this before. It is hard not to recommend. The movie is 1917. It is about World War I. Really, really great movie by Peter Jackson. If you've not seen it, please go watch the film. It's quite good, quite good.
My thought was that Peter Jackson who did that, or was that the other guy, the one who did Batman?
You know what? I'm going to double check. I know Christopher Nolan did the World War II film about Dunkirk. Yeah, I know he did that one.
I want to say that this was Christopher Nolan who did 1917. So, but I did want to.
I know Peter Jackson did They Shall Not Grow Old, which is the World War I documentary.
But I'm pretty certain this one was Christopher Nolan. So, but I do want to mention something about that movie.
Wrong. You're wrong. Finally, you're wrong.
Was it Peter Jackson?
No, it wasn't Peter Jackson. It was Sam Mendes.
But okay, but the guy who does Christopher Nolan's soundtracks, music, all that stuff is the same guy.
No, because you're
Yes, it
thinking
is.
of. Oh, does Thomas Newman do all of Christopher Nolan's music? I thought it was Hans Zimmer.
Hans Zimmer. That's what I'm talking about. Hans Zimmer. Doesn't he do the music?
Thomas Newman did the music in 1917.
All right. Well, then I guess I'm batting zero on this one. But in the movie 1917, the day that this takes place, you'll notice it says April 6th, 1917. That was they stated at the beginning. That was the day the United States declared war on Germany. Which I don't know if they did that on purpose, and if so, was it like a, I don't know. Just I always wondered, why did they pick that date of all the dates? So, all right, for me, my movie is going to be, and I know I've done this one before, but it was such a good movie, and actually it was a mini series, not so much a movie. But since we were discussing the start of World War One, 37 Days, which was a BBC miniseries. Can you see it? So it has the guy who played Emperor Palpatine from the Star Wars movies. He plays the British foreign minister, and it's a three-part miniseries. It shows the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And it shows, you're that fly in the wall in the British cabinet when they're discussing, should we go to war or should we not? And, because there was a great debate, look, Germany invaded Belgium to get at France, but, do we want to go to war with Germany over it? And some were saying, no, we shouldn't. And others were like, yes, we have a treaty. Now, I did also want to point out that you can get this. There is a 4-pack called the World War One collection. Now, I have not seen the other. It comes with 4 DVDs. I don't know if it's in Blu-ray, because the copy I have is not a Blu-ray, it's a DVD. But it does come with, and I have not seen these. It comes with Churchill's First World War. You can see that. Walter's War. Have no idea what that's about. And then Royal Cousins at War. And these are all BBC presentations. You can get the whole thing in this little pack. Again, it's a DVD. It's not a Blu-ray. It was a 100th anniversary commemorative pack, which I bought many years ago. But yeah, get this. Watch it any way you can. It's really good. It's really good. So
I've never seen those before. I'm gonna watch those. Those look good. I'm actually going to watch those because I do want to learn more about World War One. Speaking of World War One, you were talking about, I think, Europe's Last Summer was the book that you were mentioning from the European perspective. I know after talking with Neil, after we're recording with Neil, we'd mentioned some other books. I know Paris 1919 is a very good book if you want to find out what happened after the war was over during the whole the summer of 1919 in Paris and the Treaty of Versailles signing, and then trying to get the League of Nations off the ground. And also the very first month of the war, The Guns of August. If you've never read The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman, please read that. I know we mention that quite often. That book we've mentioned on this show a number of times when we typically tie in JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. And, that's kind of, I would say that's going to be the trifecta of reading about how World War One started, was to get Neil's book, Approaching Storm. I like David Fromkin's book, Europe's Last Summer, and then was it Margaret Tuchman? Is that her name? The Guns of August. Barbara Tuchman. Fantastic book also. So, look, if there's people keep saying over and over again, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Well, if, right now there's the whole war in Ukraine. And if we just jump in thinking war, we're going to find, wars never end easy. Granted, yes, there was the Spanish-American War, took 4 months, but then we ended up getting into wars in the Philippines, and that lasted for many years. So wars don't solve problems. Wars just create new ones.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, more often than not,
yeah. So,
unfortunately, and
there's
history.
just there's a lot that can be learned if we read books like Neil's, so that we don't just jump, like I said, with what's going on in Ukraine, rather than just jumping into a war thinking it's the right thing to do. We really need to sit and think. There are other things that we need to do now. There are things that we should have done prior to the commencements of hostility. So we don't seem to ever learn this world.
No, we don't, and yet when you have people in power, the people in power typically act like they know everything. And this is a great book to sort of point you in that direction of like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and then all these other sort of minor political figures, just feeling like they really know everything. Colonel Edward House would be one of those people. I think you said Margaret Tuckman. I think you sort of combined the two with Guns of August and Paris 1919. It's Barbara Tuckman and Margaret Macmillan. So there you go.
Oh.
Yeah, combination of the two. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the show. We hope that you enjoyed it. If you haven't yet, please do exactly as Alan says.
What I say? What was that? To read those books?
Follow us on.
Oh, well, see, yeah, you need to be a little bit more clear. All right. Yes. Follow us on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to us on YouTube. Now, it's very important you subscribe to us on YouTube because that's how we're trying to spread the word. We also have our own website, www.thesonsofhistory.com. But, I think this would be a good time. Now, we're on Rumble, but I believe we're going to get back on Twitter, are we not?
I was just about to ask you the same thing because I know that we had said if Elon Musk purchases Twitter, we'll get back on Twitter. So I assume yes that we must get back on Twitter. So.
I think we should get back onto Twitter. So
and we're on Getter, but Getter is just not panning out. It's not. It's such a heap. Anyways, we'll probably stay on it, but I'm not a real big fan. Speaking of last thing that you need to do, go ahead and shoot us your email address so we can add you onto the newsletter. So you can do that if you email us at thesonsofhistory@gmail.com, or you can just direct message us via our Instagram account or our Facebook account. That is it for the show. We'll talk to you later.